Want to know how people in the 1960s stayed slim? Without dieting, gyms, or counting calories? Let me show you the simple habits that worked effortlessly. A cookie was a treat, not a snack you eat all day. Plates were smaller, walking a mile to school was normal, and yet, people stayed fit without even trying. In this video, we're diving into the forgotten routines from the 60s that can help you stay naturally slim today. Back in the 60s, cracking open a soda was like unwrapping a present. It didn't come in bottomless paper cups or plastic bottles. It came in small glass ones you had to pop open with a real bottle opener. The hiss of carbonation, the cold glass sweating in your hand, and that first fizzy sip. It was a moment. You didn't keep a case in the pantry. Soda appeared when there was a birthday, a barbecue, or maybe a Saturday trip to the corner store. Because it was rare, you savored it. You didn't guzzle 3 in an afternoon. And without even thinking about it, that scarcity kept sugar from becoming a daily habit. It wasn't about quitting soda. It was just something you didn't have every day. That made it taste better, and it kept waistlines in check without anyone even trying. In the 1960s, many families relied on Grandma's pantry, filled with jars of pickles, jams, and preserves. Making food last was part of life. Cucumbers turned into crunchy dill pickles, berries became sweet jams, and peaches were canned in syrup for the winter. These forgotten foods weren't just delicious, they also kept portions controlled. You couldn't just open a plastic bag of chips. Instead, you had a spoonful of homemade jam on bread or a pickle with dinner. This tradition of home food preservation meant families ate seasonal, balanced, and in moderation. A far cry from today's endless snack aisle. If there's one dish that defined 1960s comfort food, it was the casserole. Whether it was tuna noodle casserole, green bean bake, or cheesy potato casserole, these one-dish meals were hearty but balanced. A little meat stretched across the whole dish, vegetables bulked it up, and starch made it filling. Instead of oversized steaks or fast food burgers, families gathered around casseroles that were portion-friendly and budget-friendly. It was the perfect example of Grandma's cooking secrets. Make simple ingredients taste like a feast without overindulgence. Walk into a 1960s kitchen and look at the plates. They weren't the sprawling 12-inch platters you see today. Most were 8 or 9 inches across. That meant when you filled one, the food looked plentiful even if the portions were modest. A piece of roast chicken, a scoop of mashed potatoes, and some green beans could cover the surface without spilling over. Your brain saw a full plate, and your stomach followed along. No calorie charts, no portion apps, just a natural boundary built into the dinnerware. And because seconds weren't automatic, you usually stopped when the plate was empty. That simple, unspoken limit meant fewer extra bites, less mindless eating, and more balance. Nobody planned it as a weight loss trick, but in hindsight, those small plates were doing more for waistlines than any fad diet of the decades that followed. Before breakfast came in shiny boxes with cartoon mascots, the morning meal was slower and simpler. Oatmeal and cream of wheat were staples, simmered on the stove until thick and steaming. A pat of butter, a little milk, maybe a sprinkle of brown sugar if you had a sweet tooth. No neon colors, no marshmallow shapes, no sugar crash by mid-morning. You'd wrap your hands around the warm bowl, feeling the steam rise into the cool air of the kitchen. It stuck with you through the morning because it was hearty and real, not puffed full of air and coated in syrup. It was the kind of breakfast that filled your stomach without flooding your system with sugar. And without anyone labeling it healthy, it quietly fueled kids walking to school and adults heading off to work, keeping energy steady and bellies satisfied until lunch. One of the most classic 60s food trends was the Jell-O mold. Bright, colorful gelatin salads appeared at every potluck and family dinner. Some were sweet, with fruit cocktail or whipped cream. and others were savory, with vegetables or even seafood suspended inside. While today they might look quirky, these retro dishes actually kept portions small and calories lower compared to today's rich desserts. A slice of Jell-O mold was light, refreshing, and a perfect example of how vintage food traditions helped people enjoy treats without excess. In the 60s, baking cookies wasn't about producing an endless stash. It was about making just enough to enjoy. A dozen cookies might be baked on Sunday, filling the house with the rich, buttery smell that made you hover near the kitchen. But those cookies had to last the whole week. That meant you didn't take 3 without thinking. You savored 1, maybe 2, and you made them count. There were no industrial-sized tubs of dough in the fridge, no ready-to-eat stacks in the pantry. Treats stayed treats because they were limited, and that limitation made them special. You ate slower, enjoyed each bite, and when they were gone, you waited until the next baking day. Without even thinking about it, this simple rhythm kept sugar intake down and made each cookie taste like it was worth the wait. Long before energy drinks and giant sodas, kids in the 1960s had powdered drink mixes like Tang or Kool-Aid. These drinks were served in small glasses, often mixed lightly so they weren't overly sweet. They became symbols of retro childhood food traditions, colorful, fun, but controlled. You didn't have endless refills. You had one glass, and that was it. Compared to today's supersized beverages, these small servings of retro drinks kept sugar intake far lower while still giving a sense of treat and excitement. Back then, bread was something you bought in small amounts because it didn't last long, and that was the point. The local bakery would hand you a warm loaf with a crisp, golden crust and a soft, pillowy inside. You could smell it before you even walked through the door. There were no preservatives to keep it fresh for weeks, so you ate it while it was at its best. That meant smaller portions, fewer loaves in the house at once, and less mindless snacking. When it was gone, you waited until the next bakery trip. Eating bread was an event, not a constant. And because it was real, fresh and naturally portioned by time and effort, it was enjoyed in moderation, a far cry from the oversized, shelf-stable loaves that have turned bread into an everyday indulgence. Turkey in April? Not a chance. In the 60s, big roasts, whether turkey, ham, or prime rib, were saved for the holidays. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, that's when the kitchen filled with the slow, mouth-watering smell of meat roasting for hours. You'd peek into the oven, inhale deeply, and count down the minutes until carving time. Because these feasts were tied to special dates, they were rare enough to feel magical. You didn't eat like that every weekend. The scarcity made the portions more measured, the appreciation greater, and the indulgence controlled. By the time the next holiday rolled around, you were ready to enjoy it all over again. Without realizing it, this simple tradition helped keep diets balanced, turning a heavy meal into a treasured event instead of a weekly habit. In the 60s, community gatherings weren't catered. They were cooked from scratch by the people attending. Potlucks and church suppers meant every family brought their own homemade dish: steaming casseroles, golden pies, fresh salads lined up on folding tables in the church hall or community center. You'd walk down the line, plate in hand, chatting with neighbors about whose potato salad had the good mayonnaise. Eating like this slowed everything down. You served yourself modest portions so you could try a little bit of everything, and the focus was as much on conversation as it was on food. Without giant serving platters or all-you-can-eat spreads, people naturally ate less and left feeling satisfied in more ways than one. Drinks in the 60s didn't come in mega-sized bottles or bottomless cups. They came in small, kid-sized portions. At school, you'd get a waxy little milk carton, maybe 6 or 8 ounces, or you'd bring juice in a sturdy glass thermos that clinked softly in your lunchbox. That was your drink for the meal. No refills, no supersizing. Without even thinking about it, that small portion meant fewer calories from drinks and more room for real food. It was natural portion control, long before the term existed, and nobody needed a diet plan to figure it out. Before supermarkets stocked strawberries in January, winter meant eating what you could store. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and apples, hearty foods that could sit in burlap sacks in a cool pantry for months, were the staples of the cold season. You peeled carrots for stews, mashed potatoes for Sunday dinners, and snacked on crisp apples when you wanted something sweet. Because fresh produce was limited by the season, people naturally ate a balanced diet year-round, adjusting meals to what was available. It wasn't trendy, seasonal eating. It was just how life worked. The idea of constant snacking didn't exist for most families in the 60s. You had breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and nothing in between. A hot, home-cooked meal shared at the table for dinner, a sandwich for lunch, and eggs and toast for breakfast. The day's rhythm was defined by the clink of silverware and the buzz of discussion. With hours between meals, your body has time to digest and rest from eating. This simple structure kept portions reasonable and stopped the kind of mindless grazing that's become so common today. In the 60s, if the smell of fresh-baked rolls was wafting out of the kitchen, you knew something good was happening. Those soft golden rolls were not regularly built into the meal. They were only served around holidays, Sunday dinners, or when guests were visiting. You would cut into the roll, let a pat of butter melt into it, and enjoy every bite. As they did not sit on the table in a week-to-week way, they were obviously a treat. When you had them rarely, they were treasured and did not become a weekly indulgence. In the past, ice cream wasn't something you could just pull out of your freezer every night. It was more like an adventure. You would venture to the local ice cream shop, your pocket jingling with change, and pick your scoop out of the glass counter on a hot afternoon. Vanilla, chocolate, maybe strawberry, simple flavors, but each bite tasted like magic. You'd savor it quickly before the summer heat ran it down your hand. Because it wasn't sitting in your freezer by the gallon, ice cream stayed a rare, joyful treat, not something you reached for after every dinner. Yesterday's roast chicken wasn't tossed out. It was transformed. In the 60s, cooking stretched beyond a single meal. A Sunday roast could reappear as Monday's sandwiches, Tuesday's soup, or even a casserole later in the week. Cold turkey slices were layered with crisp lettuce between buttered bread, or diced ham got folded into scrambled eggs. Leftovers weren't seen as boring. They were a sign of thrift and care. Because these second-day meals were built from whatever was left, portions naturally shrank. You weren't carving another big slice of roast. You were making do with slivers, mixing them with vegetables, or folding them into rice. It was economical, but it also meant you weren't eating heavy portions day after day. Meals were lighter, waste was rare, and the idea of throwing away perfectly good food was unthinkable. In the 60s, a steak didn't take over your whole plate. Cuts were modest. 4 to 6 ounces was about standard, and they were served alongside generous helpings of vegetables and potatoes. A small sirloin with green beans and roasted carrots felt like a full meal because the plate was balanced. Eating less meat wasn't a sacrifice. It was just the way things were, and it kept calories in check without anyone having to count them. In the 60s, a pantry lined with neatly stacked cans was a weeknight lifesaver. Green beans, peas, corn, all sealed in their briny or sweet liquid, ready to be dumped into a saucepan at a moment's notice. The metallic pop of the can opener meant dinner was halfway done. These vegetables weren't flashy, but they meant every meal had something green on the plate. Canned produce made it easy to keep portions balanced without much extra work. And since the vegetables were usually served plain or with just a small pat of butter, they were far lighter than today's cream-heavy or cheese-laden sides. A plate might hold a small piece of meat, a scoop of potatoes, and a spoonful of peas. Simple, balanced, and filling. The convenience kept vegetables on the menu year-round, which quietly helped keep waistlines in check. Butter was a flavor accent, not a blanket. A small pat was dotted over vegetables or spread thinly on bread, just enough to give a rich golden taste without drowning the food. You'd watch it melt over a pile of green beans or sink into warm toast, adding just enough indulgence to make it satisfying. Using it sparingly made it last longer and kept dishes flavorful without going overboard. If you wanted fries in the 60s, you couldn't just hop in the car and hit a drive-thru 5 minutes away, because there probably wasn't one. Fast food restaurants were rare, and the ones that did exist were often a good drive from home. Grabbing a burger and shake wasn't an everyday convenience. It was a small family outing. Maybe once or twice a month, you'd pile into the car, head to a neon-lit roadside stand, and eat in paper-lined baskets. The rarity made it special, and the inconvenience meant you didn't rely on it for dinner. Without the constant temptation of a giant soda or supersized fries, calories stayed in check without anyone counting them. Fast food was a treat, not a staple, and that made all the difference. Dessert in the 60s often came straight from nature. A crisp apple, a bowl of stewed pears, or a few juicy peach slices in a ceramic dish could be the sweetest part of the evening. Sometimes it was dressed up with a sprinkle of sugar or a dollop of cream, but often it was just the fruit itself. The natural sweetness was enough, and it kept dessert light, fresh, and far healthier than the sugar-heavy treats we've grown used to. One large baked potato, steaming hot and split down the middle, could be dinner in the 60s, and no one thought twice about it. You'd fluff the inside with a fork, add a small pat of butter, maybe a sprinkle of salt, and dig in. Sometimes leftover vegetables or a spoonful of chili topped it off, but the potato was the star. It was filling, comforting, and naturally portion-controlled. Unlike modern loaded potatoes piled with bacon, cheese, and sour cream, 60s baked potatoes were simple. They provided slow-burning energy without the heaviness of a meat-heavy dinner. Families didn't need an enormous plate of food to feel full. Sometimes, all it took was one humble potato. Sandwiches were about balance, not bulk. A single thin slice of ham or turkey was layered with crisp lettuce, ripe tomato, and maybe a smear of mustard or mayo. The bread held it all together without spilling over. You got all the flavor of the meat without making it the entire meal, and the veggies added freshness and crunch. It was satisfying without being overstuffed, proof that less can taste just as good. In many parts of the 60s, your butter might have come from a farm down the road, not a factory across the country. Local creameries and small dairy farms produced butter with a rich yellow hue and little flecks of cream. The flavor was so pure and intense that you didn't need to slather it. Just a thin dab melting over warm bread or steamed vegetables was enough. Meals weren't drowning in butter or swimming in cream sauces. Dairy was a complement, not the main event. That small but powerful difference kept calories lower without anyone talking about diets. It was about savoring flavor, not chasing excess. In the 60s, the calendar decided your menu. If it wasn't growing in your area, you simply didn't eat it. Summer meant corn on the cob and tomatoes still warm from the sun. Autumn brought baskets of squash, apples, and hearty root vegetables. Eating with the seasons made every flavor feel fresh and fleeting, something to be enjoyed while it lasted. And when it was gone, you waited patiently for its return next year. In the 60s, a good portion of dinner might have come straight from the backyard. Families grew rows of tomatoes, beans, cucumbers, and lettuce, picking them fresh just before meals. Dirt under your fingernails from gathering dinner wasn't unusual. It was a sign of pride. Fresh produce meant fewer preservatives, less sugar, and no hidden fats. Vegetables weren't engineered for extreme sweetness or loaded with salt like many packaged versions today. They were seasonal, meaning your diet naturally rotated, keeping it varied and balanced. Eating what you grew also encouraged portion awareness. You only had as much as the garden produced. And because you worked in the garden to get them, hoeing, weeding, harvesting, you were burning calories before the first bite. It was exercise and nutrition rolled into one. Cabbage was the quiet hero of the dinner table, cheap, filling, and endlessly versatile. It showed up as creamy coleslaw beside fried chicken, steaming in a pot with potatoes, or rolled around a savory meat filling. The smell of braised cabbage drifting through the kitchen was a sign of a hearty meal on the way. It bulked up plates without adding many calories, keeping families full on a budget. A true old-fashioned meal that many remember from the 60s was liver and onions. It might not be popular today, but back then it was common and considered nutritious. The strong flavors, sautéed onions, and rich iron content made it a staple. Because portions were modest and sides like boiled potatoes or cabbage balanced the plate, it was a meal that filled you up without excess. Today, it stands as one of those forgotten foods that shaped Grandma's kitchen traditions. Soup night was a way to stretch whatever you had in the fridge. A pot of simmering broth, loaded with chopped vegetables, and maybe a few shreds of leftover meat, could feed the whole family. The kitchen would fill with the warm, savory smell of stock bubbling on the stove. Served with a slice of bread, it was filling, nourishing, and far lighter than today's cream-heavy recipes. For many families in the 60s, Friday night meant fish, baked, broiled, or lightly pan-fried. This tradition originated from religious practice, but had a beneficial consequence: replacing red meat with leaner protein once a week. By eating fish, such as cod, haddock, or trout, we could eat filling protein with significantly less saturated fat than beef or pork. There was no pig out with the portions. Additionally, because the sides generally were boiled potatoes and vegetables, the meals were light, but still satisfying. The vibrant smell of fish frying in butter was still a weekly event, with a caloric count far less than a steak dinner. This simple change from red meat to fish meant that many lighter meals were consumed without any mention of dieting over the course of the year. Eating habits like these that relied upon routine rather than restrictions are another way in which people simply live without gaining weight. Weight has been maintained not by counting calories, but by merely eating in a pattern of indulgence and restraint. In the school cafeterias of the 1960s, meals were simple and portioned. Small milk cartons, a sandwich, a piece of fruit, and maybe a scoop of vegetables on a plastic tray. There were no supersized options, no endless snack packs. This vintage cafeteria food tradition taught kids balance and moderation. It was all about structured eating habits, real food in reasonable portions, without constant snacking. In the 60s, sweet treats weren't a daily habit. They had a schedule. Baking day, often on Saturday, filled the house with the smell of cinnamon, chocolate, or vanilla. But that was it for the week. You'd make a pie, a batch of cookies, or a cake. And once it was gone, that was it, until the next baking day. Having little or no access to store-bought bakery desserts or snack aisles made desserts rarer. As such, sugar and refined flour products were not hitting your diet every day. The rarity made you appreciate the treats more, and the built-in limit on your supply meant less temptation. It was a delicious rhythm that kept waistlines steady without anyone calling it portion control. In the 60s, salads were dressed, not drenched. It took a quick drizzle of olive oil and vinegar and/or a thin layer of mayonnaise to bring out the freshness of the lettuce, tomatoes, and cucumbers. This method gave vegetables flavor without disguising bland vegetables in heavy calorie-laden sauces. Salads were usually part of the meal as a starter or side and were consumed in smaller portions, but also had a good amount of fiber and vitamins, so they would help you feel full without all processed calories. Since dressing was used judiciously, often just enough to coat the leaves, salads would remain light, crisp, and slimming. There were no oversized bowls swimming in ranch or Caesar. It was simple, balanced, and refreshing. This small habit alone cuts hundreds of calories from weekly diets without anyone realizing it. The greens shone as the star of the plate, and the light touch kept both the flavor and waistlines intact. In many 1960s homes, families canned and froze vegetables to last through the winter. Rows of mason jars lined up in the pantry, filled with beans, corn, or tomatoes, were signs of thrift and tradition. This grandma's food preservation habit meant fewer processed foods and more seasonal eating. Because preparing these foods took time and effort, portions were naturally more modest, and the appreciation for each jar was greater. It's one of those forgotten eating habits that shows us how valuable homemade preservation was in keeping diets balanced and waste minimal. Candy in the 60s wasn't always in the pantry. You had to go out and get it. Often, that meant a trip to the corner store with a few pennies in your pocket. You'd buy a small paper bag of gumdrops or licorice, and when it was gone, it was gone. There were no jumbo packs, no constant snacking, and no shelves of sweets in every room of the house. This scarcity naturally kept sugar intake low. Because candy was a treat you had to earn or save for, it was savored slowly, not eaten by the handful. A boiled dinner was always simple in a pot. Meat, potatoes, and cabbage all simmered away for a long time to reach tenderness. The steam would fog up kitchen windows, filling the whole house with a comforting smell. These meals were hearty meals with nothing heavy. The boiling process cooked off unnecessary fat, and the meals were naturally balanced between protein, vegetables, and starch. There was no frying, no thick gravies, and no rich sauces to pile up calories. Because it all cooked together, flavors melded without needing extra butter or cream. The result was a filling, warm meal that left you satisfied without feeling stuffed. It was humble, nourishing, and waistline-friendly, the kind of comfort food that didn't weigh you down. The 1960s showed us that staying slim wasn't about diets or gyms. It was about simple, forgotten food traditions. Smaller plates, seasonal produce, homemade casseroles, limited sweets, and grandma's recipes created a lifestyle where balance came naturally. If you enjoyed this trip back in time through forgotten 60s meals and vintage eating habits, hit like, subscribe, and share your favorite retro food memory in the comments below.